No genre has more sequels than horror, and while there are exceptions, an awful lot of horror sequels suck. Far too many of them are focused on milking a story far past its sell-by date in order to create a profitable franchise. And in these often endless narratives, characterization nearly always takes a back seat. Horror sequels do have a nasty habit of screwing over the characters from their predecessors, prioritizing long-term financial success over good character arcs. Some horror sequels thoughtlessly kill off their predecessors' characters for cheap shocks. Others retcon a previous victory in order to keep the sequel factory going, and others just keep throwing all of these unearned narrative curveballs at viewers in order to create new story opportunities. Alternatively, there are other sequels which did on paper feel like a justified continuation of a story, but proceeded to take the characters in completely the wrong direction. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie for What Culture, and let's take a look at these great horror movie characters ruined by terrible sequels. Starting with Annabelle. In Annabelle the doll wasn't actually in 2013's The Conjuring that much, and she wasn't even a part of the main storyline. Having said that, that's easy to forget. Such was the impact of this sinister doll. She was so creepy, creating an overwhelming sense of dread every second she was on screen, and she instantly became the single most iconic element of this wildly successful franchise, which is one of the only cinematic universes outside of the MCU that's actually worked out. As such, when a spin-off about the character was announced, it seemed more than justified, and audiences were thrilled to see more of Annabelle, who seems set to be a terrifying killer doll for the ages. They shouldn't have been. 2014's Annabelle was a disappointingly mediocre spin-off to such a great horror film as The Conjuring, and arguably its biggest problem was, believe it or not, Annabelle herself. It turns out that the doll itself isn't really malevolent. Rather, some generic demon has latched onto the doll, but the doll itself rarely plays a big part in the movie's scares. And thus, Annabelle stopped being any sort of presence and just became a vaguely creepy prop. The two subsequent Annabelle films, 2017's Annabelle Creation and 2019's Annabelle Comes Home, were quite a bit better, yet both also struggled to work out what to do with Annabelle herself. She's still iconic, but ironically enough, she hasn't been particularly effective in the majority of her big screen appearances. The Exorcist believer, Chris MacNeil. Chris MacNeil was, in the 1973 original, a completely amazing character. A possessed child's parent is often a fairly whatever role, but not here. Chris feels like a real human being and is given a ton of depth, while the brilliant Ellen Burstyn gave one of horror cinema's very best performances in the role. As such, the way the Exorcist believer treated her was just maddening. They brought her back primarily to dump exposition on the audience and also to get stabbed in the eyes by a possessed girl, which happens because she recklessly goes to stop the demon even though she's definitely wise enough to know better. Oh, and she's also estranged from Reagan, who returns at the very end in a meaningless cameo, because of course she is. Burstyn did admit that she only returned to the part 50 years after her previous appearance, in fact, because she was funding an acting scholarship. So at least something good came out of this return. Burstyn wasn't as good as she normally is here, and it seems likely she was aware that she was in a crap film. It Chapter 2, Pennywise. It Chapter 2 is even worse than you remember. The pacing is awful. It doesn't have a single scary moment, and it keeps killing the tone with excessive comedy, meaning that the whole thing is as tonally misjudged as it gets. Sadly, Pennywise the clown's dignity is not left intact by the end. First up, he's not in his clown form nearly enough, and he takes on a variety of ridiculous, unintentionally hilarious guises throughout the movie. At one point, he's a giant naked CGI witch who chases Beverly in the movie's worst scene. In another, he's a leper that spews in Eddie's face, while Angel of the Morning from Deadpool blares in the background. Seriously, what was up with that? And then he gets defeated by the surviving members of the Losers Club, telling him they're not afraid of him anymore, which causes Pennywise to shrink enough that they can kill it. To be fair, Pennywise's defeat in the novel wouldn't have translated well to the screen, as it was very much an internal psychological sequence, involving a complicated ritual. But even so, this maddeningly anticlimactic finale was still the wrong way to go. It's just a shame, as in the first movie, Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise was incredible, maybe even better than Tim Curry's iteration, and the way this sequel ruined him was pretty scandalous. Spiral? Pretty much everyone. Time for a really obscure one now. When the Ring novel series was being adapted to film, the producers made a bizarre choice. They decided to make and release Ring and its sequel Spiral simultaneously, with different filmmakers and creative teams at the helm. Ring deviated from the books and was a fully fledged supernatural horror film. Spiral is more faithful to the novels and leans into the sci-fi elements. It's hard to believe that anyone actually thought this was a good idea. While Ring, a horror masterpiece, was a huge hit, Spiral bombed, so much so that the studio made a new and better sequel to replace it the next year. It deserved to bomb, for it's too dull and poorly written to work on its own terms while also completely failing as a sequel. The tone and genre are radically changed, the story doesn't follow on from what was established in Ring, and worst of all, every character from the original is ruined. Ring's protagonist Reiko and her son Yoichi were weightlessly killed off screen, while Yuji's entire character is retconned. According to this sequel, he was working with the original film's ghost antagonist Sadako all along. Like that makes any sense. And as for Sadako herself, the cursed tape barely features, and she's no longer one of the most terrifying movie ghosts ever. She's now a sexualized supernatural femme fatale who spends all her screen time with her face uncovered. Misjudged is an understatement. Hannibal, Clarice Starling. As the long-gestating direct sequel to The Silence of the Lambs, one of the most beloved and iconic horror films ever, Hannibal is easily one of the most anticipated horror films there's ever been. Unfortunately, it also became one of the most disappointing. It was inferior to its predecessor in every single way, and it ruined that movie's protagonist, Clarice Starling. Frustratingly, Jodie Foster decided not to return to her most iconic role, so Julianne Moore was cast instead. On paper, Moore was a perfect choice, and seemed like an ideal way to make the best of a bad situation. Funnily enough though, she fell weirdly flat in the role, perhaps because of the writing more than anything else. Despite how fantastic Clarice was before, this time around she feels more like a garden shed variety FBI agent, and the movie also made the fatal mistake of keeping her and Hannibal Lecter apart for almost the entire thing, when their relationship was the heart of the original film. Thankfully, the movie didn't use the infamous ending of the source novel, where Hannibal and Clarice become lovers and run away together. But it still let Clarice down overall. Maybe that's why Foster didn't come back. Don't Breathe 2, Norman. Sometimes a horror movie villain should just be allowed to stay a villain. Case in point, Norman from Don't Breathe, played by the terrific Stephen Lang, who's best known these days for being the main antagonist in both Avatar movies. In 2016's Don't Breathe, Norman was one of the finest horror movie villains of the 2010s. The film follows 3 robbers who break into Norman's house. As he's a blind man, they assume he'd be an easy target. He ultimately turned out to be a fierce, psychopathic killer who hunts via sound. He's also captured and forcibly impregnated a woman who he's holding captive in his basement, and he later tries to do the same thing to that movie's protagonist. That part of the film was unnecessarily icky, perhaps, but Norman was otherwise a faultless horror movie monster played to fearsome perfection by Stephen Lang. So yes, Norman deserved to come back for a sequel in some form, but not like this. 2021's Don't Breathe 2 turns Norman into the anti-hero protagonist who's trying to protect his adopted daughter. It expects viewers to root for a psychopathic thug who raped and murdered his way through the original film. As such, even in its better moments, Don't Breathe 2 is a profoundly uncomfortable watch. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Sally Hardesty. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre's Sally Hardesty is significant for being one of the very first final girl characters in movies. She actually predates Halloween's Laurie Strode by a few years. She's also one of the best examples of the archetype. Much like the other heroic characters in Tobe Hooper's largely magisterial horror film, Sally isn't particularly developed, yet Marilyn Burns' strong performance made her a memorable figure all the same. As such, when 2022's Texas Chainsaw Massacre treated poor Sally like dirt, it left the nastiest taste behind. She deserves so much better than this. In this mostly underwhelming legacy sequel, Hardesty is a grizzled Texas Ranger who's been waiting for a rematch with Leatherface for 50 years. Unfortunately, the filmmakers made the inexplicable decision to have Sally killed by Leatherface in the most flippant of ways. Firstly, this was a disrespectful way to treat an important character, who, aside from a silent cameo in one of the early sequels, never actually returned on screen before. And secondly, it felt unearned because the way Sally died was so avoidable. She had decades to prepare for this showdown after all, and she had a gun. Why didn't she just shoot Leatherface in the head instead of running at him like that? Battle Royale 2 Requiem, Shuya. In the brilliant Battle Royale, Shuya is a down-to-earth everyman, the kind of blank slate audience surrogate great for this kind of outlandish story. He's likeable, he's empathetic, and viewers will be glad that he survived. In this movie, he's last seen fleeing from the authorities alongside fellow survivor Noriko, and it would be great to pretend his story ended there. In Battle Royale 2 Requiem, the appalling sequel released in 2003, Noriko largely escaped unscathed as she only appears very briefly. Shuya, on the other hand, takes a central role. He's now an Osama bin Laden-esque terrorist waging war on the Japanese government. Yep, that's actually what happens. Turning a peaceful, decent kid into a violent mass murderer was bad enough on its own, but making him the leader of a clear Al-Qaeda standing group took this to the next level. The movie portrays Shuya as a sympathetic anti-hero, even though he's established as having killed thousands upon thousands of innocent people in an attack that's a transparent allusion to 9/11. I mean, what the hell is this? As well as being a bad sequel, Battle Royale 2 is also one of the most offensive films ever produced. The kind of thing so morally repugnant one wishes it didn't exist. And finally, the Halloween franchise, Michael Myers. Michael Myers. He's one of the greatest horror movie villains there will ever be. A simple yet devastatingly effective representation of pure, unstoppable evil. At least that's what he is in the few good Halloween movies. Unfortunately, poor Michael has been undermined or outright ruined so many times throughout this troubled franchise. Halloween 2 introduced that dumb twist that he and final girl Laurie were siblings, although it at least tried to kill him off definitively. Halloween 4 proceeded to resurrect him and made him overpowered instead of a grounded force of evil. Halloween 6 ruined the mystery of the character by having him be under the control of some ridiculous cult, rather than leaving his motives ambiguous. Halloween Resurrection featured the rapper Busta Rhymes karate-kicking Michael out of a window while yelling, "Trick or treat, mother effer," thus turning a once terrifying character into a complete joke. Rob Zombie's Halloween remake isn't as bad as people say, but it did miss the point again by giving Michael a detailed backstory involving an abusive family. And finally, in Zombie's ill-judged 2009 sequel to his remake, Michael spent most of the film with his mask off, having all these weird visions of his dead mother with a white horse. Thankfully, Michael was scary again in David Gordon Green's recent trilogy, and he was given a definitive ending. Hopefully, he'll be allowed to stay dead at last. But that seems unlikely.